Success Insight shares the stories of the people with passion and drive who make things happen in the world. Here's your host, Howard Fox.
Hello, everybody. This is Howard Fox. For my co-host, Randy Ford, I want to welcome you to another episode of the Success Insight podcast. Our guest today is John Nassivera. John is an author, songwriter, illustrator, and founder of the Front Porch Storytelling. And I really found this very fascinating. John's mission is to create community one story at a time by complementing the good work of our neighbors and what they're doing so that the good continues. John has authored a number of books, including The Garden Raid, which was published back in 2016, Chain Links, which is an eBook set to songs, and that was released in 2018. And he's currently working on his third book, The Magic You Don't See. And there are excerpts from that on his website, Front Porch Storytelling, and we'll share more about that in just a little bit. John, welcome to the Success Insight podcast.
Well, thank you for having me. I've enjoyed this opportunity already.
Well, John, I find it extremely interesting that I hear author, songwriter, illustrator, and now you've founded the Front Porch Storytelling. But you've got an interesting background in education. You're a former educator. So what I think our guests would love to learn is a little bit more of that backstory, who you are, what prompted you to get into this business of writing these kinds of books for, I would say, young teens, perhaps even a little bit younger. So tell us your story.
So I grew up in a small town in the Adirondacks in upstate New York, right along the Hudson River. And it was the height of manufacturing. It was the 60s and the 70s. And at that time, the whole Hudson River up where I lived was lined with GE, Crown Zellerbach, Scott Paper. And the particular plant in my town worked 24/7 and probably employed well over 4,000 people, which was greater than the population of the actual town I grew up in. So when I graduated from college, I found myself in New York City in the Department of Education. So that was a big jump for me, culturally wise and community wise also. And I started teaching in the early 80s. I taught for approximately 33 years in New York City. It's the largest school system in the United States. And with that, and it's all its challenges and diversity, it offered a lot of opportunities. So I had a very interesting and fulfilling professional life when I was there. I started off teaching on 102nd in Amsterdam. I taught with a high school that was considered an alternative high school. They addressed students who had been to high school, 2.5 different high schools, had no credit, and were at that age where it didn't seem they were going to be able to accumulate the credit and the needs and meet the requirements to graduate. So the whole school was designed around addressing that.
What age was that?
That was high school age. So the average student that entered was 17 and a half to 18.
Okay.
When they entered the school, they had been to 2.5 high school on average prior to coming to us, and they had no credit.
Okay.
Normally, high school is approximately 4 years. Through that 4 years, you accumulate a number of credits, which is one of the criteria of graduation. So just from their age and time reference and the number of failures, so to speak, in reference to reach this goal, there was a lot of challenges. And the challenges weren't just about education. The majority of the challenges were what's happening in real life with these students. So we actually had, within the school, we had a nursery for teenage pregnancies to address that. We had a lot of schools that came from different cultural situations, and it was really diverse. We had a program for young juvenile offenders and people who had just made some difficult decisions, or life had made difficult decisions for them. And to tell you the truth, if you don't have a home, if you don't have food, if financially there's no money, these challenges really are roadblocks to kids even getting to school. And once there, to stay focused.
Sure.
That was the challenge in my first steps and introduction to New York City education. Then I had an interesting discussion one day. I heard two kids talking, and it was the difference between a small town and big town understanding. And the kids were saying they had never seen the Hudson River, or they've never been downtown.
Oh, wow.
Now, Manhattan's an island, and at its greatest distance, it's 7 miles long, and it's only a few miles wide.
Right.
It's just a strange concept to hear that you've never seen a river that's really hundreds of yards away from you. But it's more of a concept that a city block probably has more people on the city block than I had in my hometown. So my perspective was coming from a different place. And what that triggered in me is not only had they not seen the Hudson River, they hadn't seen all the resources that were available to them. So, for example, New York City has the largest financial district, theater district, informal learning centers such as the American Museum of Natural History, the Botanical Gardens, the Bronx Zoo. All these things existed, but yet they weren't being introduced to them. And there didn't seem to be a mechanism to connect them to these. And then that raised the question around education should flow outside the physical walls. And having all these resources, how do you create the systems and structures to provide that opportunity for the kids? So I got involved. My first step was with the American Museum of Natural History. A gentleman named Peter Vreeland was with the education department. And we started looking at how we could do curriculum that would bring kids to the museum and they could do actual science. And we came up with this sort of forensics curriculum that looked at dinosaur fossil trackway was there that said the big question was, well, what happened that day so many trillion years ago? And they had to collect evidence, either measuring footprints, going through the exhibits, talking to scientists. And that ended up being published. And we ended up actually presenting that at the National Science Teachers Association down in Orlando one year. So that was a good success professionally. And even more importantly, it just opened the door to different informal learning centers that allowed the teaching to move the kids outside the classroom. And then the next big connection was we were connected with the city universities, Lehman College and Hunter College and City College, which allowed us to design and create teaching curriculum for teachers that then grew the opportunity for more and more students to have this experience. So that was one of my first successes with the schools.
It's interesting as you're sharing this story. One of the words that kind of floated to my conscious was the word curiosity. Is these kids had never been taught or perhaps didn't have the concept of what being curious was beyond just their four walls, their neighborhood, their block they lived on. And these types of programs were a great mechanism to teach them that there is a bigger world out there. Maybe it is going as far east or west of the Hudson, depending on what direction you're at in Manhattan. But with the advent of these programs, how did this kind of work in your educational background start to inform your interest in writing, songwriting, in the work that you're doing now in your book? How did that get informed?
I think it was the seeds of the idea and my mission, creating community one story at a time by complementing the good work our neighbors are doing so that good continues. Because their community was their block community. Then these programs help them venture outside of that community, become connected with, let's say, the museum, the Botanical Gardens, the Bronx Zoo, which they're now, the Bronx Zoo is in the Bronx, a different borough than Manhattan, the financial districts. They're now immersed in a different community that not only allows them to build relationships, but to gather understanding of how the world works outside the block. There's been a lot of studies to say, and to take the simple thing of how we have dialogues with other, and it's called coding. We speak differently when we're on the block with our friends than we do when we're in church, than when we do when we're on the job, right? Or other locations, other community areas. And if we don't have that ability, it hampers our ability to assimilate into a dialogue, building relationships, and growing. I think the initial seeds come from that whole idea of, hey, the world sometimes for us, we see the world through our own perspective, and if we can expand that perspective and have relationships and have experiences in different communities, then that will help the good work that is being done at these other communities. And it also helps the people from the block, so to speak. That goes back to my roots in my hometown. And that's what made the connection to the book writing. When I was growing up in my small town, my mother used our front porch as an outdoor living room for family and friends to pass time. And it was a place where she would sit and she would tell stories. And there was advice that was garnered on the front porch, jokes that were told, melodies that were sung, and stories that were spun. And that connects directly to the work that I'm doing through my writing. And through her storytelling, she told tales that taught us about cultural ideals of family, friends, and community, right? And I try to carry those lessons she taught me in my approach to writing. And that was similar to what I was doing when I was doing that work at the school, is my stories and music address the subtle messages of friendship, community aspect, respect, collaboration, forgiveness, relationship, and acceptance. And basically moving off the block, those kids were engaged in all of that and learning how to do that outside something that was a community that was comfortable to them. So I think that's a connection that comes from the educational profession I had. Plus, I think the other connection is education is an act of service, and my writing and my vision mission is also an act of service. It's reaching out to people, connecting with people, and trying to support them in their drive and their journey to become what they want to be and be successful.
Sure. And I was really struck by the one of the paragraphs you included in our prep work for today's show of your mom and being out on the porch and sharing stories. And I grew up in a suburb of Detroit, and we had porches. And they were not the same kinds of porches, where these big wraparound porches where you had lots of seating, and depending on whose turn it was that day, the neighbors and kids would all show up, and that would be the storytelling, the playing, and all the activity would take place on that porch. And I have to admit, John, you brought back a lot of memories because of the house I grew up in, and I remember even my uncle who lived in Detroit with my grandmother at the time, they had one of those big wraparound porches. And there's one memory I have when I had to have been preteen. I mean, very young, but it's just a memory that is stuck with me 50 some years later, believe it or not, of, just being out there. And it's almost as though I can see it today, even as I'm talking about it. And that must have been just a phenomenal experience of all the community gathering that takes place on that porch.
Yeah, and you want to know something through my research? The front porch is unique and was started in America. It's an American design architectural feature. And the whole purpose was to bring the living room out to the front porch. Bring it outside where community is and can grow. And that's unique to the United States and American architecture. And if you walk through like the town you're talking about, my town, it would be house after house and sidewalk. And if you're walking down the sidewalk, the front porch is right there and it's calling the whole community in. And it really was designed in America around American architecture to create this whole idea of community. And bring the living room from inside and bring the people out together within their community. So it is also something unique to American architecture. I didn't initially think it. I was more writing from the heart, from my life experience, and then that was just something else that I felt was a nice connection, that it actually was designed to do that.
See, that's interesting. I never knew that as well. And I'm actually curious, even within the confines of Manhattan or the boroughs of New York, Manhattan going up into the Bronx, and those homes, and I'm not that familiar with the architecture, the neighborhood architecture, but I imagine there were stoops or steps that people, even in Manhattan, even in New York, would hang out on in the early evening hours or morning hours where neighbors would still gather together in their own way. It wasn't the same as the Porch where you grew up in upstate New York, but they still had their porches as well. And I think that's enlightening too.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. That's the way it is. There's a stoop. And if you really think about it, for me, it was my front porch. And for the kids I was working with, it's the stoop in their block. That's what their block was acting as. So the idea with connecting the informal learning centers was just to expand the porch or the block to a bigger community.
Sure.
But you're absolutely right. It's the same perception, the same gathering. It's just a little different architecture or physical setting.
Right.
Blocking the front porch.
Now, you spent 30 some years within the education system in New York. And then did you have in mind, I mean, your first book, the Garden Raid, published in 2016, had you been working on that, or did you retire and say, okay, it's time to write, here's the books I've been thinking about writing? How did that first book come about?
I don't know if this is true for everyone, but for me, I had a very enjoyable profession. I had a career that was 30 some odd years. I had a lot of opportunities. I even had the opportunity where I designed and created and opened a brand new public high school, which is probably something every teacher dreams of doing. But I reached a point where I started feeling that maybe I need to evolve into something else, that maybe this career is reaching its end. I even started physically feeling it. So the last few years, the question was, well, where do I go from here? Who am I? What will I be? And I've always had a desire to work with young people. And I always had this desire around, since I was a young kid even, illustrating children's books and books. And that's where the first initial feeling towards writing a book and illustrating came from. So my last year, I would say, as I was retiring, I was playing around with, well, what do I want to say? I don't really want to write to a market. So if you looked at the market now, you might find that fantasy and some other areas are what's hot and selling.
Yes.
I felt more like, just like in my profession as an educator, that I had something important to share with people that could help them. And that's where the front porch and those experiences are the stories that my mother told me. And actually the Garden Raid and Chain Links Were Better Together the setting is actually the town I grew up in. It's a fictional book. And I have another book coming out in the spring that I did not mention, which is called 4th and 4. Again, and it's all, even though the setting's set there, it's really around the stories my mother told me and the subtle messages. How do I share those messages with other young people? Because it meant a lot to me, and it actually sculptured and changed and made who I was.
Excellent.
Now, the unique thing was, from there was, once I started getting the Garden Raid down on paper, it kept coming back to me as, well, why am I doing this? What is really the mission behind that? And that's when creating community one story at a time evolved from. And the real quest that I have is, how can the words on the page, how can the story jump off the page and become an active agent to create community? Not just through the story itself and whatever subtle messages, but how can the work actually create community? And that's really the enjoyment that I've been having in actually putting out the Garden Raid and then moving towards Chain Links Were Better Together. My first book opening, my book launch, I didn't want to do an author's read. I didn't want to do something similar like that. I wanted to involve the community. So I actually did a book launch back in my hometown where my old front porch was. And there were a number of members from the community who were doing a lot of good work around creating community. One was Jonathan Newell, who has done so much great work around creating community through music and the arts. So I joined him. He jumped on board with this book launch. There was some photographers and galleries who had images from the setting, the town, and we got involved with the school system that I used to go with. So I actually did a book launch where it was a combination of music being sung by local artists. Then the students from the 4th and 5th, 6th grade came in and did a short book reading play from a section of the Garden Raid. And there was a lot of visuals from local artists that talked to the town and the story. And then I spoke for a little bit. So it actually was a community launch.
That is fantastic. And I thought you were going to say you went from porch to porch and everybody, maybe had a little specialty to deliver on one porch and you went down the street to the next porch. But in any case, I love the fact that you have included the community in this work. And I've been to enough book launches and book signings, and somehow they look alike, sound alike, feel alike after a while. But I mean, to include the entire community, that's something entirely different. I love that. And did you do something similar with like chain link fence? Because this is an ebook set to song. So seems like there's a whole other opportunity here. So tell us more about that.
It's so funny, isn't it? It's the work we do reveals so many different avenues to take. And that's part of the pleasure of doing the work, what you engage in. The other part is the word community, coming together with others, because I always ask this question of myself. I've been doing it since I was young. What if, right? What if I didn't do the average book signing, read and signing? What if I include the community? And then you start speaking to the people and they add what if we did this with it? What if we did this with it? So with chain links, one interesting story with that is through its development was I was with a friend who I taught with, and it's Albert Bouchard. He happens to be the drummer for Blue Oyster Cult, a big rock band back in the 80s.
I remember that.
70s, 80s, I should say. And I said, hey, Albert, I really would like to do a book trailer, and I was thinking some music. Do you want to collaborate? Can we figure out something? I was in his New York City apartment, and he's got an apartment that's like a sound room, recording room. It's unbelievable. And another friend, David Hirschberg, who was a teacher and bass player, and we're playing, and we started this whole, well, what if we do this? What if we do that? And it came to, well, what if the whole book was set to song? What if a person could pick up this book and have the chapters introduced to them through song? And that just kept growing. And the nice connections to that from an educational standpoint is so many of our young people have difficulty gaining entrance to the story through written text. But if they could hear it from a different modality, such as music, or see it through illustrations, that complements the story and gives them greater access to the written word. From the educational aspect, I was going like, this is going to help so many kids get engaged with the story. From the creative aspect, it just blew up. It blew up because from that room of Albert and Dave and I, and it ended up when we were close to 15 different musicians ended up participating from New York City all the way up into the Adirondacks. And the community grew. And it was a matter of creating systems and structures, how does this come together? But the end result is that ebook, the reader can pick it up, and because of technology, you can press a button, the lyrics introduced, you have the written lyrics in front of you, the song plays. You can also, through the hyperlinks in it, just press the artist's name, and you can engage with the artist from wherever they are through their social media and websites and things of that nature. So the actual physical book grew in many ways off the pages. You can now, right from the electronic pages, access music, illustrations, and the artists and the people that are performing. Also,
that's absolutely wonderful.
Well, the other wonderful thing I really enjoyed is that the music, 12 of the artists are from the town, the setting of the book. It was most of the songs were recorded in a studio in that area. So now all these artists are coming together. Their community is growing. People are becoming aware of them. It just really has been blossoming into like the work revealing the new avenues to create community. The other unique thing with Chain Links for Better Together is when I had the manuscript, I went into the intermediate school where I grew up. And I had worked out with the superintendent and the principal. I said, wouldn't it be nice to bring in a manuscript and the kids could engage with the work as it's being done and see how that affects literacy. And the 24 chapters were actually named by the 4th, 5th, and 6th graders of that intermediate school. So when you open up that book,
that's truly a community book.
Yeah, their influence is now stamped on the written words in the book. And then one or two of the songs, I would go in and say, here's a song I'm working on, and the artist might come in with me, and the kids had an opportunity to be reflective, and they put their fingerprint on a couple of the songs. And one of those songs is Feeling So Cool. So it's just been very unique, surprising. The avenues are revealed as I'm working and through the relationships, which brings me to, I was doing this other project and there's this 3-letter word, joy. It's so powerful, but yet 3 letters. And I started doing some research. Well, what's joy really mean? Because it's not happiness. It's much more than that. And the 4-letter word, love, is so powerful. It's so open-ending. And part of the research I found at Yale University, there was a research project, the theology of joy and the good life. And what it was basically, there was so many interviews done with people who were experts in their field, whether it was economics, mathematics, religion, philosophy, theater, musicians. And as I went through the dialogue, there seemed to be 5 specific things that just kept repeating itself and coming off and out of their words. And it sort of defined joy for me, and it helps shape the work that I do. And I think it could help people in the work they do with other people. The first thing was connects. Joy connects by engaging in the needs of the community. The second thing, builds relationships, forms and nurtures social groups to support and advance a healthy community. The third was purpose, helping people use their strengths to create innovative and sustainable solutions and deepen their self-purpose and their sense of purpose. The fourth was service, acting and cultivating acts of service to humanity. And the fifth one I thought we don't do enough is gratitude and celebration, expressing and nourishing the accomplishments of the work and giving back so the good continues. So now I try to use those 5 things to guide and to open doors for me in trying to achieve how does the story jump off the pages and become an act of creating community.
It dawns on me too is that the importance of this work and your definitions of joy, connects, relationships, purpose, service, gratitude, celebration. That it resonates because we talk, there's a lot of talk about that in the adult development, the adult leadership realm, management realm. What I find is the ironic is Chain Links for Better Together, and then the new books that are out there is that, if we start to embrace these concepts and nurture these concepts in our young children today, we're going to be much better, I think, when we become adults. I suspect there's some truth to that.
Yeah, I would say even if you look at our conversation today, one of the things that influenced me the most was me as a young child and my mother on that front porch telling those stories.
Yeah, yeah.
And that carried with me, and that's who she was. It carried through my childhood and also through my community. It was, and I would say, using what your discussion now, I think that's when I embraced it. I practiced it through my community, in my relationship with my mother and brothers and sisters, families and friends, and within my community. And it carried into my educational profession. And I see it walking right through this new journey I have in reference to writing and illustrating and songwriting, because I've never written a book before, and I've never written a song before. And I'm not a trained artist either.
I think you're starting a movement. I think this classifies as starting a movement, and it's a pretty darn good movement. John, in the time we have together, I want you to share the best ways for our listeners to get to learn more about you and your work. But I am curious about one thing. In the 30-some years as an educator, now as an accomplished author, and getting involved in the illustrations and the songwriting, have there been any communications from people that have known you throughout the year, say outside of your immediate family and friends, that have come across this work that you've done, know about you from your prior life? And I'm curious if they're there, and what has been their reaction to the work that you're doing?
I recently, just last week, I did a book fair that had 150 some odd authors involved within it. And I had a few people come up to me that I did not know, that had read the first book, had read the second book, and just stopped by to talk with me. And a few things. One was, that stuck out to me was the connection, not to necessarily growing up on the front porch, but more or less to what you were speaking to earlier, having a life experience like on the block or in Detroit, like you were explaining, that was similar, a place where the community had come together and shared jokes and songs and stories and politics and the cultural ideas that we're speaking to around friendship, community acceptance, respect, collaboration, forgiveness, acceptance, were taught to them. And when they read or heard the songs, they were brought back to that moment. And it just sort of surfaced to them that, well, this part of me it came from someplace similar that the story is speaking to. And there was a lot of commonalities in reference to how they were, what they did as a profession or had completed as a profession, that were similar, that were influenced by their life experiences that were similar around the front porch. So I thought that was one unique situation. The other thing was, which I find constantly happens, is in the work, I constantly are being introduced to people who sort of grasp the idea or had threads of it running through their DNA about this act of coming together as a community, more of a global community, and the ideals that subtle ideals that the stories share, and how they have been active participants in their life, and possibly some new ideas of how they were going to use different mediums, not necessarily music per se or book writing, but acts of joy, making connections, building relationships around a specific purpose, actually getting engaged in the work through service and celebration. So I hear the undertones of that word joy in the work that they're doing, and that famous question I like to ask myself, what if? Where they are starting to look at things similar to what I did, in that I never wrote a book, I never wrote a song, I don't sing. Why would I take this avenue to express and to try to create people to move, nudge them, become active community builders in their own communities?
There's a gentleman I met this week, wrote a book called Yes and. It's originates from Second City here in Chicago, and I love the what if, because for me the next thing after what if is then yes and. Now what? Now that you've done this, what if I do it? Okay, yes, you did it. Then what? What's next? And I love that. And John, if our listeners would like to learn more about you and your work, where's the best place for them to go?
I would say go right to the Front Porch. My website is frontporchstorytelling.com. If you go there, you'll find a lot more about myself, the work I'm doing. It's constantly being updated, new books coming out, music. It'll give you access to it. If you just want to listen to music, you can find the music either by my name, John W. Nassivera, or by the title Chain Links Were Better Together on Spotify, Pandora. If you're into streaming, if you want to download, you can go to iTunes or Amazon Music. It's all accessible there. I'm also on Pinterest with some of my artwork. So those people that are there, there's several avenues right there. And if you want Goodreads, if you're a reader, Goodreads is the place to go just to find a little more about me.
Excellent. Well, you are definitely prolific on the social sites, and I admire that. And because I've been, since you and I met a couple of weeks ago to plan this podcast, and I've certainly have seen your postings probably on LinkedIn, but and peruse the website as well. And so, John, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to discuss this wonderful work. And I am really looking forward to staying in touch and being an observer on this journey with you. Thank you.
Well, thank you for this opportunity. I've enjoyed your shows, and to tell you the truth, just this introduction of us and coming together and taking a look at who you're speaking to and what they're saying has been very powerful to me. It's pretty amazing the power of one. One person has so many gifts to share, and I thank you for creating that avenue where they can get out and share it.
Thank you so much. There you have it, folks. We have been chatting with John Nassivera, author, songwriter, illustrator, and founder of Front Porch Storytelling. John's mission has been to create community one story at a time by complementing the good work of our neighbors, what they're doing, so that the good continues. And we're going to provide links back to his website, Front Porch Storytelling, as well as his social links, and including the Amazon book page, so you can learn more about this work and pick yourself up a copy of Chain Links We Work Better Together. So folks, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, go out there, have a phenomenal day, and we'll see you on the next episode of the Success Insight Podcast. Take care now.
Success Insight is a production of Fox Coaching and First Story Strategies. Find us online, successinsightpodcast.com.